There's a kind of weight our law enforcement loved ones carry that we rarely talk about. It's not fear and it's not trauma, it's guilt. Not guilt from doing something wrong, but guilt from not being able to save everyone. Today, I want to share a story I heard years ago that completely changed how I understood the weight that they carry and what we as spouses and families need to recognize at home. Hi, my name is Amy Cortez. I'm a mother of two and a spouse of a law enforcement officer who has served for over 30 years. Several years ago, my husband and I attended a post-critical incident seminar, a PCIS. I remember walking into a room filled with law enforcement officers from all across Ohio. Highway patrol, city department, sheriff's office, and dispatch. Everyone was seated in a large U-shaped table. Each officer had their spouse or significant other beside them. And I remember thinking something that I now realize is so naive. I thought, wow, many of these people have been involved in shootings. Because at the time, I believed trauma in law enforcement only came from the biggest, most dramatic moments. I didn't understand how their guilt worked. I personally walked in that room believing trauma meant a shooting. And don't get me wrong, there were definitely officers in the room that had horrific stories and had been involved in shootings. I'm going to be honest. As a spouse, I thought if there wasn't a shooting, it wouldn't affect them very much. That assumption was naive and dangerous. I also remember noticing a bunch of Kleenexes sitting in front of each seat. I thought it was a little strange, but after all, we were in Ohio, and in Ohio, winters bring lots of sickness. So maybe there were a lot of sick people there. My husband even joked, "Oh no, this is going to be bad." And of course, everyone laughed. By the end of the session, I think most of those Kleenex boxes were empty. As we went around the room, officers and spouses shared why they were there. The stories were raw: loss of partner, marriage strained by the trauma, the emotional toll of the job spilling into the home life. I remember the first story of a woman who was from the state highway patrol, and she started off by talking about losing someone on her team. She was an FTO, a field training officer, and it was the first month that this young trainee was on his own. The emotion from her was raw as she described the events that led to his death. And so it went on. Each person down the line shared their traumatic story. Spouses shared the struggles of their marriages due to the trauma. About 15 people in, a dispatcher began to speak. At first, she talked calmly about the pressure of sending people she loved, friends, coworkers, into dangerous situations every single day. Then she completely broke. She shared a story from what had started as a typical shift. Her lieutenant had just ended his shift and was on his way home. I believe she said it was his daughter's birthday, or maybe it was his wife's birthday, but he was headed home to a birthday party. He was a devoted husband and a father to several young girls. The shift she describes was extremely busy. Everyone was already dispatched when a domestic violence call came in. She said it didn't sound urgent, but it definitely needed a response. So she called the lieutenant on his personal cell phone and asked if he could swing by. After all, it was right on his way home. He agreed and signed back on to take the call. I won't share all the details, but it was an ambush that he walked into. He was shot immediately upon arrival and killed. With tears flowing heavily, she described the extreme guilt she felt. She continued to describe, I took a husband away from his wife. If I would just not have called him, he'd still be alive. As a dispatcher, she was trained on how to prioritize calls. I'm sure she was following their protocol. And our law enforcement officers are trained to make decisions to problem solve in the most chaotic situations. They are trained to be the calm no matter what is happening around them. And yet she herself carried the weight as if she had pulled the trigger that had killed him. That was the moment I understood something critical. Guilt in law enforcement certainly isn't logical. It doesn't follow our normal rules, and it doesn't care about the facts surrounding the situations. Because my logical brain was telling me she had done everything right. It wasn't her fault. She wasn't to blame. But that's not what her brain was telling her. Because guilt for them sounds something more like, if I had arrived sooner, if I had said something different, if I hadn't made that call that day to his cell phone, even when the outcome potentially would be the same regardless of that decision. Their brain searches for control in situations where there was none. The dispatcher wasn't weak. She was human, doing the job that she had been trained to do. I remember at one point they separated the spouses and law enforcement officers apart from each other, and I ended up being in the group with her husband. He buried his head in his hands and he said, I didn't even know she was carrying this around. I just knew she was different and her job was really affecting her. Can you imagine the burden and the heavy weight that she was carrying? That's the same burden and weight your loved one is probably carrying too. Dispatchers, officers, deputies, they all carry guilt differently, but it all lands the same. I've seen glimpses of this in my own husband's story. Some of the hardest moments he shared involve children. He once told me about a young child that was pinned in a car seat after a rollover accident. He tried desperately everything that he could to lift that car off of this little one. He described to me the different ways that he tried to get her out since he couldn't get the car off of her. But nothing he did could get her unpinned. He had backup coming, but he knew they would not make it in time. So he crawled underneath the car, the best that he could, and told her just to squeeze his hand. She did until she was gone. He too felt the guilt and still carries a piece of that, I think, with him today. What haunts them isn't always what they did wrong. It's what they couldn't fix or how they couldn't be that superhero. Here's what we as spouses and family need to understand. Guilt rarely opens the door and walks into a room and announces, here I am. No, it shows up as silence and withdrawal, irritability, emotional numbness. There are times where I look at Mike in a situation and I say, why are you so calm? Why aren't you freaking out or having a meltdown like me? It's because they are just sometimes numb. And sometimes it comes out as overworking, being busy, always on the go, never sitting still, always having to do or be somewhere. These things are them pushing away the demons that they don't want to have to face. It's not them pushing us away in those situations. It's oftentimes them punishing themselves or just trying to keep their minds busy. But we have to understand that guilt carries shame, which thrives in that silence. That's why so many loved ones don't talk about it, especially with us. They don't want to relive it, and they certainly don't want to burden us. And they don't want to admit when they couldn't be the hero. As spouses, I know I'm guilty, but sometimes I just think, why can't they just let it go? Or why are they still carrying this around? Because in my mind, the facts are they couldn't have done anything more. I'm sometimes guilty of these thoughts. Thinking back to the dispatcher, I remember her saying, I couldn't go to his funeral and face his family. That was a sign that she was hiding because of the guilt. For those of us not in law enforcement, I think about our occupations and how maybe we process situations. For me, I've spent over 3 decades in sales leadership. When I lose a sales deal, I get frustrated, I get angry, and I constantly replay it over and over in my mind, trying to figure out what I could have done differently because I can do better next time because for me, there was always a next time. But here's the difference. My decision never ended with life or death. In law enforcement, there's no next time for that specific call. Sure, their brain still replays it, but for them, there's no redemption. You need to be aware that they are probably carrying around some of this guilt of not being able to fix or have a different outcome. And there's a real possibility they probably cannot talk about it with you because they want to protect you. This is why building your village, which we talked about in episode 5, is so important. Because guilt festers when it has nowhere safe to land. And the isolation they put themselves in to survive is dangerous. In order for healing to begin, they have to have a trusted connection. If you think back to this dispatcher story, her husband said, I didn't even know she was carrying this. I just knew she was different. That's often how it's going to look for us at home. I recently read about moral injury in law enforcement. Moral injury is a lasting emotion and psychological response to events that potentially can violate a value. In the case that I was reading about, an officer was involved in a pursuit where the suspect drove into the path of a train and killed him. The officer in that situation had followed protocol. He did everything correct. He did absolutely nothing wrong. And yet the guilt consumed him. And later, he took his own life. When guilt goes unprocessed long enough, it can turn inward. And sometimes it does convince good officers they're better off gone, even when they did nothing wrong. So here's what I want you to remember today from this episode. Your loved one may be carrying guilt you'll never fully understand. And remember, guilt doesn't follow logic or facts that we can see clearly. And silence does not mean that they're healing. We as loved ones are not expected to fix them, only to help them not carry it alone and encourage them to process it in a way that isn't silent and doesn't compound on top of other events. Let's end with a prayer. Lord, thank you for the men and women who serve and for the families who carry this weight with them. Please give us wisdom to see what's beneath the surface and give us the patience when guilt shows up as silence. Please give us courage to support our loved ones with compassion instead of pressure. Amen. In one of our next episodes, we're going to talk about how to recognize when guilt has crossed a line and how to know when outside help is needed. If this episode spoke to you, please subscribe now or follow Code 44. You are not alone, and they are not alone.